On the morning of the 9th of October 1926, a driller named Otis Vance climbed down into the Bonanza shaft outside Picher, Oklahoma, to finish a round of holes his crew had started the day before. He was 31 years old, married 4 years, with a boy at home and a second child expected by Christmas, and he had worked the tri-state lead and zinc field long enough to know the chert of the Boone Formation by the way it bit back against a drill steel. The company he worked for, the Cardinal Mining and Milling Company, had leased the ground 18 months earlier and was pushing the shaft past the 140-foot level, well below the shallow ore bodies most crews in the district were still working at the time. Vance's crew had been told to expect ore any day. What his drill found instead, a few feet past where the last round had stopped, was open air where solid rock should have been, a hollow space that swallowed the steel almost its full length before it hit nothing at all. He shut the machine down, backed the crew off, and climbed up to widen the hole by hand with a bar, working carefully in the close heat of the drift until the opening was large enough to put a lamp through. What the lamp showed him, and what he would describe the same way for the rest of his life, whenever he allowed himself to describe it, was not a natural cavity. It was a passage, squared at the sides, running level in both directions as far as the lamplight reached. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Vance did not go in alone. He climbed back to the surface and brought down his shift boss, a man named Carl Detweiler, who had run crews in the district for 11 years and had seen his share of natural solution cavities in that limestone country, the kind of hollow the local miners called a vug and thought nothing of. Detweiler went in first with his own lamp, and by every account Vance ever gave, the older man's manner changed within a few minutes of entering the passage. The walls were not the rough, water-carved surfaces a vug in that formation should have shown. They were cut, dressed flat in long courses, the joints between the stone blocks fitted close enough that Detweiler ran his knife blade along one seam for nearly a foot without finding a gap wide enough to catch the edge. The passage held a consistent height of just under 6 feet and a consistent width close to 4, dimensions that did not vary by more than an inch or two over the 60 feet the two men walked, before Detweiler called a stop. No timber shored the walls. No tool marks matched anything either man recognized from a century of pick and drill work in that same rock. And the floor, swept nearly clean of loose stone, sloped downward at a shallow, even grade that neither man could explain by any natural process either had witnessed in that formation before. What Otis Vance and Carl Detweiler were looking at, based on the descriptions that survive through Vance's family and through a single surviving fragment of Detweiler's own account, was a corridor built with a precision the local geology should not have allowed anyone to achieve without leaving some trace of the effort behind. The Boone Formation under Ottawa County is Mississippian limestone and chert, laid down roughly 340 million years ago under a shallow sea, a dating that is not disputed anywhere in the region's geological literature and that no part of this account challenges. Natural solution channels do form in that rock, carved slowly by acidic groundwater over long spans of time, and they are common enough in the district that miners rarely gave them a second look. But a solution channel does not run level for 60 feet with squared walls and fitted joints. It widens and narrows unpredictably, following whatever seam of weaker stone the water found first, and it never produces a floor with a consistent grade cut into hard chert. Detweiler measured what he could with the tools he had on him, a folding rule and his own 2 hands, and the numbers he later gave Vance's family matched almost exactly what would be recorded 5 years afterward at a second site many miles away, a coincidence that only becomes meaningful once the second site enters this account. The stone itself was chert, the same hard glassy rock the district's miners fought through with every round of holes they drilled, and cutting it cleanly with hand tools available in any era before modern rotary equipment would have been slow, difficult work for whoever had done it. There was no debris left behind. No chips, no waste stone, no discarded tool, nothing but the finished surface itself, and a floor swept nearly bare. Detweiler had worked that formation for over a decade, specifically because he understood what a natural cavity in it looked like, and it was precisely that expertise that made him stop at 60 feet, rather than continue on. He told Vance they had gone far enough for one day. They never went back in together again. What happened next is where the record becomes traceable in a way that the story of the passage itself is not. Detweiler reported the find to the Cardinal Mining and Milling Company's district superintendent the same evening, according to a company payroll ledger that survives today in a private collection in Ottawa County, a ledger that also records an unusual notation for the following 3 days. For the 9th, 10th, and 11th of October 1926, the shift log for the Bonanza shaft contains no entries at all, a gap that does not appear anywhere else in 11 months of otherwise continuous daily records for that same crew. The log resumes on the 12th, with a single line noting that the crew had been reassigned to a new heading 40 feet to the northeast, away from the direction of the passage entirely, and that the original drift had been backfilled with waste rock through and past the point where the hollow had opened. Backfilling a drift that had been actively producing was not standard practice anywhere in the district at the time, and the labor and material cost of hauling enough waste rock to seal 60 feet of open passage would have been considerable for a company already operating on thin margins during a period of falling zinc prices. The company's own cost ledger for that quarter shows a line item for additional fill material that the mine's own engineer, in a margin note beside the figure, described only as authorized by the superintendent, no further explanation given. The same ledger records a second, smaller payment made that same week to a driller listed only by his last name, Vance, for what the entry calls extra shift work, a payment that does not correspond to any additional hours in the crew's regular timesheets for that period. Whether that payment was meant to secure Vance's silence in the same way Vance's own family always believed it was, or whether it reflected some other arrangement lost to time, the ledger itself offers no explanation, only the figure and the date beside it. No inspector from the State Mining Department appears to have visited the Bonanza shaft that October, though state inspectors did visit other Cardinal Mining and Milling properties in the district that same month according to surviving inspection records, a routine that makes the absence of any visit to the Bonanza shaft during the exact week of the backfilling harder to read as coincidence. Carl Detweiler left the company's employ the following spring, in the spring of 1927, and moved his family to a different mining camp in southwest Missouri. He never worked the tri-state field again under his own name, though a Cardinal Mining and Milling personnel card, also preserved in the same private collection, lists a Carl Detweiler working briefly under a construction contractor in Joplin later that same year before the trail runs cold. Otis Vance stayed in Picher and kept working the district's mines for another 2 decades, through the boom years and into the slower ones that followed. He told his wife about the passage once, not long after it happened, and told her almost nothing more about it for the rest of his life, except for one detail he repeated to her more than once in later years. He said the air in the passage, 60 feet in, had not carried the damp mineral smell that every other drift and drop in that district carried without exception. It had been dry, he said, and still, in a way that unsettled him more than the stonework had. Vance's daughter, interviewed decades later by a regional historian collecting oral histories of the district's mining families, recalled her father growing quiet whenever the subject of the Bonanza shaft came up at family gatherings, and remembered him once saying that whatever had cut that passage had known exactly what it was doing and had not needed a single wasted motion to do it. He never claimed to know who had built it or when. He only ever insisted, to the small handful of people he trusted with the story, that the stillness of the air down there was not something a man forgot. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Bonanza shaft passage was not the only find of its kind in the district, and the pattern across the other sites is where the story stops being one man's account and becomes something closer to a documented recurrence. In the summer of 1908, 18 years before Vance's discovery, a drill crew working a lead prospect outside Joplin, Missouri, less than 30 miles from Picher, and inside the same Boone Formation geology, broke into what the crew foreman described in a letter to his brother as a stone hallway, too straight and too clean to be anything but built. The letter, held today by a Joplin area historical society that acquired it decades later from the foreman's descendants, describes fitted stonework and a level floor in language strikingly close to what Detweiler would later describe at the Bonanza shaft, down to the detail of a dry, still air pocket that the foreman found unsettling enough to mention twice in a 2-page letter. The mining company involved in that Joplin find, a firm that operated for only a few years before folding during a downturn in lead prices, left almost no surviving corporate records, and the shaft itself was abandoned and flooded not long after, its exact location now uncertain, even to local historians who have tried to reconstruct it from old plat maps. The foreman's letter does contain one additional detail the Bonanza account does not, a claim that the crew, before being pulled off the heading entirely within a matter of days, had followed the passage far enough to find a second corridor branching away from the first at a shallow angle, still cut and finished in the same manner, still running level, disappearing into the dark before anyone thought to measure how far it continued. The foreman wrote that his crew chief refused to let anyone go further without lanterns enough to see them back out safely, and that by the time proper lighting was arranged, the heading had already been ordered closed by the company office in town, with no reason given, beyond a note that the prospect had proven unproductive. A second and more thoroughly documented case surfaced in 1931, 5 years after Vance's find, at a mine outside Galena, Kansas, roughly 25 miles from Picher, and again within the same regional geology. There, a mining engineer named Roscoe Byrne, working for a different operator entirely, and with no apparent knowledge of either the Bonanza or the Joplin finds, filed a formal survey report describing a squared passage encountered at depth, complete with measured dimensions that fell within a few inches of the figures Detweiler had given for the Bonanza corridor. Byrne's report, unlike the earlier accounts, made its way into the operating company's official files, and it requested authorization for a full excavation of the passage to determine its extent and origin. The company's board denied the request within a week, citing cost concerns in a 1-paragraph response that survives in the same file as Byrne's original report, a response that offered no engineering counterargument to Byrne's findings and no alternative explanation for what his survey had measured. Byrne was transferred to a different district the following season. His personnel file, examined decades later by a regional mining historian, lists the transfer as routine and gives no further detail. He spent the remaining 22 years of his career with the company working exclusively in districts far from Ottawa County, and never again filed a report mentioning the Galena passage or anything resembling it, even in later surveys of nearby ground that would have given him a professional reason to revisit the subject if he had wanted to. What connects the Bonanza shaft, the Joplin prospect, and the Galena mine is not simply that each contains a passage no known culture in the region's accepted timeline is credited with building. It is the consistency of the physical description across 3 separate discoveries made by people who, as far as any surviving record shows, had no contact with one another and no way of coordinating an account, even if they had wanted to. A squared corridor a few feet wide and a little under 6 feet tall, cut clean through hard chert and limestone, with fitted joints too tight for a knife blade, floors graded evenly downward, and in every single account, an atmosphere inside the passage that felt wrong to the men who entered it before anyone had reason to think it should. Coincidence explains one such account easily enough. It explains two with more difficulty. 3 independent discoveries across 3 counties and 3 unconnected mining operations, each closed off or denied further study within weeks of being reported, is a harder pattern to set aside. The physical evidence from all 3 sites has, as far as any public record shows, never been reopened for modern examination. The Bonanza shaft was capped entirely when Cardinal Mining and Milling ceased operations in the district in the early 1950s, part of a broader closure across the tri-state field, as ore grades declined and, later, as the ground itself around Picher grew unstable enough that federal authorities would eventually order much of the town evacuated. The Joplin location has never been precisely relocated. The Galena mine's surface workings were dismantled decades ago, though the shaft itself, according to county mineral records, was never formally sealed with concrete and remains, at least on paper, an open legal hazard that the current property owner has fenced off rather than filled. One piece of physical evidence did survive outside any institutional archive, and it is the piece that keeps this account from resting on testimony alone. Otis Vance, on the day he and Detweiler entered the passage, picked up a single loose fragment of the cut stone lying near the entrance, a flat piece roughly the size of a man's palm, worked smooth on one face in a way the surrounding chert never naturally takes, and carried it out in his coat pocket without telling Detweiler he had done so. He kept it in a cigar box for the rest of his life, and gave it to his son before he died in 1953. That son passed it to his own daughter, and the fragment remains today in the possession of Otis Vance's granddaughter, still living in northeastern Oklahoma, who has shown it to a small number of researchers over the years but has declined, so far, to submit it for laboratory dating or to make its exact location public. She has said only that her grandfather asked her, before he died, to keep it in the family and never to sell it, a request she has honored for over 70 years without fully understanding why it mattered so much to him. It is the only physical object from any of the 3 sites known to exist outside a sealed or inaccessible shaft, worked stone from a passage that official geology has no explanation for and no institutional record has ever formally examined. What the passages demand, if the descriptions left by Vance, Detweiler, the Joplin foreman, and Roscoe Byrne are taken at their word, is an explanation for finished, engineered stonework sitting inside bedrock that no accepted timeline places any builder deep enough or early enough to have cut. The standard record of human presence in that part of North America extends back several thousand years at most, associated with peoples who left surface structures, mounds, and tool scatter, but nothing resembling squared subterranean corridors cut with that kind of precision into hard chert at depth. Nothing in the conventional account explains who built these passages, when or why 3 of them, discovered decades apart by people with no connection to one another, were each closed off within days of being reported, in each case by a decision made above the head of the man who found it, and without any surviving record of the reasoning behind it. Otis Vance died in Picher in the winter of 1953, in a town that would itself be gone within a generation, swallowed first by the mining that made it, and then by the ground collapse and contamination that mining left behind. He never went looking for the passage again after that October in 1926, and by his family's account he rarely spoke of it, except for that one detail about the still, dry air that he could never quite let go of. The Bonanza shaft sits capped and buried today, under ground that has since sunk and shifted more than once, its exact position on the surface no longer marked by anything a visitor would recognize. Somewhere beneath that ground, 60 feet of squared corridor, and however much further it ran past the point where 2 men decided they had gone far enough, waits exactly where it has waited since the 12th of October 1926, sealed by a decision nobody left behind an explanation for, in rock that has kept its silence longer than anyone involved in sealing it managed to keep theirs. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.